This is chapter 10. I did especially well in my surgical rotation. I was as conscientious as anyone else in the class, but twice as fast, which just goes to show that basketball had served me well. Fast was how hospitals made their money. So while accuracy was very much appreciated, speed got noticed. Just before graduation, the attending pressed me to take another 3 years for a subspecialty in thoracic surgery after my residency. I had spent the last 2 hours assisting in a right lower lobectomy, and he admired the deftness of my knots. We were sitting in a tiny room with a set of bunk beds and a desk, a place we were meant to sleep for 20 minutes between classes. I think I could still smell blood, and I got up for the second time to wash my face in the small sink in the corner, while the attending droned on about my bankable talent. I wasn't in much of a mood, and as I dried myself with paper towels, I told him I might have talent, but I had no plans to use it. "So what are you doing here?" He was smiling, anticipating the punchline of what he was sure was a setup to a joke. I shook my head. "It's the rotation. This one's not for me." There was no point in explaining. His parents had probably come from Bangladesh so that one day their son could be a surgeon in New York. His entire family had doubtlessly been crushed beneath a load of debt, and they didn't need to hear about the effort it took to liquidate an education trust. "Listen," I said, pulling off his scrub top, throwing it in the bin. He said, "Surgeons are kings. If you can be a king, there's no point in being a jack, am I right?" I could see every bone in his rib cage. "I'm a jack," I said, and he laughed, even though I failed to make the joke. There are two kinds of people who come out of this place: surgeons and the ones who didn't make it as surgeons. Nobody else. You are going to be a surgeon. I told him I think it was just time for him to shut up. My 20 minutes were down to 14 minutes, and I needed every one of them. I was exhausted beyond anything I could remember. I wanted to tell him I wasn't going to do a residency, or an internship for that matter. Medical school would finish, and I would crack the code on real estate and sail out of this place without so much as a backward glance. Except I didn't. I tried and failed and tried again and failed again. Buildings lingered on the market for years and then sold for a fraction of their worth. I saw buildings in foreclosure go for as little as $1,200. And even when they were burned out shells covered in graffiti, even when every pane of glass had taken a brick, I thought I was the one to save them. That's what I thought. Not the people, mind you, the ones who might have lived in those buildings. I had no grand ideas that I was the one to save the men and women who lined the hallways of the ER, waiting for a minute of my time. I wanted the buildings. But then I would have to settle up the back taxes, buy the doors, fix the windows, pay the insurance. I would have to dispatch the squatters and the rats. I didn't know how to do any of that. Despite every promise I had ever made to myself, I went into the internship program at Albert Einstein in the Bronx. Not only was there no tuition for internships. Okay, Maeve said, I didn't know that, but they paid me. At this point, the trust was obligated only to cover my rent and give me a small amount for expenses, which I banked. I was no longer bilking Andrea in any meaningful ways. Not that I ever had. I was no longer avenging my sister. I was, in fact, finishing my training in medicine. I got along with the people I worked with, impressed the faculty. I helped my patients, and every day reinforced the lessons I had learned in chemistry. You don't have to like your work to be good at it. I stayed at Albert Einstein for my residency, and while I still made the rare trip to the law school in Columbia, where I stood in the back of the hall to take in a lecture on real estate law, those trips were now few and far between. I followed the real estate market the way other men followed baseball. I memorized statistics and never played the game. Dr. Abel still kept his eye on me, or maybe, as he would have said, we had become friends. He invited me for coffee every 3 or 4 months and kept at me until we locked down a date. He would talk about his students. I would complain about my workload. We talked about departmental politics, or when we were in the company of our better selves, science. I didn't talk to him about real estate, nor did I ask him if chemistry had been the thing that he wanted to do with his life. It wouldn't have occurred to me. The waitress brought our coffee. We're going to London this summer, he said. We've rented a flat in Knightsbridge. 2 whole weeks. Our daughter is working there, Nell. You know Nell. I know Nell. Dr. Abel rarely mentioned his family, either in deference to my own situation or because that wasn't the nature of our relationship. But on this particular spring day, he was too happy to keep his personal life to himself. She's doing art restoration. She went over there 3 years ago for a postdoc that turned into a full-time job. I don't think she's ever coming back. There was no point in mentioning that Nell Abel and I had exchanged a champagne-soaked kiss one New Year's Eve in his apartment years before. She had come into her parents' bedroom while I was digging through a pile of black coats on the bed, looking for the black coat that belonged to Celeste. The room was dark, 1,000,000 miles down the hallway from the music and from the laughter. Nell Abel. We had tipped into the pile of coats for a couple of minutes before righting ourselves. We haven't been to see her a single time since she left, her father went on. We always make her come home to us. But Alice finally secured the major gift for the Health Sciences Building campaign. 5 years she's been chasing that money down. Alice told them she'd quit if they didn't give her time off. Alice Abel, who had so kindly set a place for me at her table all these years, worked in the development office of the Columbia Medical School. I wondered if I had ever known any more about her job than that. I wondered if Dr. Abel had been telling me this for years. His wife's job was to raise money for a new health sciences building. I wondered if Alice had told me this herself, and I had just failed to register it. I used to run into her every now and then, walking across campus. She would ask me about my classes. Did I volley back a question in order to fulfill the tenets of public or polite conversation? Or did I merely answer and wait for her to ask me something else? They do some kind of X-ray of paintings now, Dr. Abel was saying, to find out if there's another painting underneath. Pentimento, without all the guesswork. Where? I asked. I could sense what was coming before I could fully comprehend it. My future, this moment. The Tate, Abel said. Nell is at the Tate. I took a sip of coffee, counted to 10. Where will they build the new health sciences building? He waved his hand as if to indicate up there, north. I have no idea. You'd think that would be the first order of business, but until they get that major gift, they don't make any commitments. I imagine it has to be somewhere near the armory. Do you know about the armory? What a disaster that's going to be. I nodded my head, and when the waitress brought the check, I caught it. Dr. Abel fought me, and for the first time since I had known him, I won. I stopped by the Columbia bookstore to get some maps of the medical center campus and Washington Heights before heading back to the Bronx. The undergraduates I passed could have been boys of 14, shaggy-haired and barefoot on their way to the beach. I sat on the steps of the Butler building in front of Southfield and unfolded my purchases. Like Dr. Abel, it seemed to me the area near the track and field armory was inevitable, even if the medical school had yet to come up with this conclusion. The armory was about to be converted into an 1,800-bed homeless shelter, which would doubtlessly lower the price on surrounding parking lots. They weren't hard to find. By the end of the week, I had 2 under contract with a 6-month due diligence period. After all those years of banging on a locked door, I found a door wide open. The seller was a man long convinced he had no options. He had fired his broker and wore a collared shirt and tie to our meeting, hoping to take care of things himself. He was tired enough to take the deal I offered. I told him I was a doctor, and doctors had no safe place to park. I made him laugh when I said that. That was why none of us had cars. He liked me enough to feel sorry to be sticking me with 2 parking lots that had been for sale for 3 years. He thought I was cutting my own throat when I asked for a specific performance clause in the contract. He would surrender the right to change his mind, and I would surrender the right to change mine. We were locked in this together. The seller was promised he would walk out of the deal with money in hand in 6 months. The buyer promised to find that money and claim the parking lots. In retrospect, it looked perfectly obvious, but at the time I might as well have been standing with my back to a craps table, throwing dice over my shoulder. I was buying 2 parking lots next to a massive homeless shelter. I was betting money I didn't have on the assumption that I would own the land beneath the building that had yet to be placed. I was banking that the decision about the placement of the building would be made before I had to get a loan and never qualify. 5 months later, I sold the parking lots to the College of Physicians and Surgeons, and with the considerable proceeds, I paid off the seller, got a loan from the housing fund, and put a deposit on my first building on West 116th. Most of the 18 units there were occupied. The storefront on the ground floor was split between a laundry and a Chinese takeout, both businesses in good health. According to the comps, the building was undervalued by 12%. I was finally pursuing opportunity beyond my resources. I was not a doctor. I was at last myself. I would have dropped out of the residency program on the day I signed the escrow papers, but Maeve said no. You could still get a doctorate in chemistry, she said. You like chemistry. I didn't like chemistry. I just wound up being good at it. We'd had this conversation before. Then think about business school. That would come in handy now, or law school. You'd be unstoppable with a law degree. The answer was no. I had my career, or at least the start of one. It was as close to insurrection as I ever came. Well, she said, there's no point in quitting now. Finish what you started. Maeve agreed to keep my books and handle the tax exchange codes while I went back to Albert Einstein with less than 6 months on the clock. I didn't regret it. Those final months were the only parts of my medical training I ever enjoyed, knowing that I was just about to walk out the door. I bought 2 brownstones in foreclosure, one for $1,900, the other for $2,300. They were disasters, but they were mine. 3 weeks later, I went to Immaculate Conception back in Jenkintown to attend the funeral of Mr. Martin, my high school basketball coach. Non-small cell lung cancer at the age of 50, having never smoked a day in his life. Mr. Martin had been good to me in those storm-tossed days after my father's death, and I remembered his wife, who'd sat in the bleachers for all of the games and cheered the team on, a mother to us all. There was a reception afterward at the church basement, and when I saw a girl in a black dress with her blonde hair neatly pinned, I walked over, touched her on the shoulder. As soon as Celeste turned around, I remembered every single thing I'd ever liked about her. There were no recriminations, no distance. I leaned down to kiss her cheek, and she squeezed my hand the way she might have done had it always been our intentions to meet there in the basement after a funeral. Celeste had been a friend of the Martins' daughter, a detail I'd either forgotten or had never known. I learned a lot about Celeste in the years she'd been gone. I came to see her willingness to not be a distraction as something that took effort. I didn't even know to be grateful for it until I was with other women who wanted to read me articles from the paper in the morning while I was studying, or read me their horoscope, or my horoscope, or explain their feelings to me while crying over the fact that I had never explained my feelings to them. Celeste, on the other hand, would sink into her giant British novel and stay there. She didn't slam the plates trying to get my attention, or walk on her toes to show how thoughtful she was about not making any noise. She would peel a peach and cut it up in a dish, or make me a sandwich and leave it on the table without comment, the way Sandy and Jocelyn used to do. Celeste had been so adept at making me her job that I hadn't seen her doing it. It wasn't until after she left that I realized she'd stayed those Sunday nights because Sunday was when she washed the sheets and did the rest of the laundry, made the bed, and then got back in it. She and I picked up where we left off, or picked up in that better place where we'd been a couple of months before the ending. She was living back at her parents' house in Riddall. She taught reading at the public grade school. She said she missed the city, and pretty soon was taking the train on Friday nights and going home on Sunday, the way I had always wanted her to. She worked on her lesson plans while I made rounds at the hospital. If her parents questioned the morality of our arrangement, they never said a word. Celeste was closing the deal, and they were going to let her do it in her own way. In all the years I'd known her, going back to that first train ride and the chemistry book, I'd never told Celeste anything about my plans. She knew I didn't have parents without having been told the details of what that meant. She didn't know about Andrea, or of the trust, or that we had ever lived in the Dutch house. She didn't know that I had bought 2 parking lots and sold them to buy a building, or that I would never practice medicine. I hadn't even made a conscious decision to exclude her from this information, only that I didn't make it a habit of talking about my life. The residency program was almost over, and the rest of my classmates had finished their interviews, accepted offers, put deposits on moving vans. Celeste, who prided herself on not asking too many questions, was left to wonder where I was going and whether or not she would be coming with me. I could see her pressing herself down, remembering what had happened the last time she'd presented an ultimatum. I knew that the uncertainty was terrifying for her, and still, I made love to her and ate the dinner she prepared and put off talking to her for as long as I could, because it was easier. But in the end, of course, I told her everything. There was no such thing as jumping into a lake part way. One explanation led to another, and soon we were falling back through time. My mother, my father, my sister, the house, and Andrea and the girls, and the trust. She took it all in, and as the stories of my past unfolded, she had nothing but sympathy for me. Celeste wasn't wondering why I had taken so long to tell her about my life. She took the fact that I was telling her now as proof of my love. I put my hand on her thigh and she crossed her other leg over it, securing me to her. The only part that was incomprehensible to her was the least interesting detail in the entire saga. I wasn't going to be a doctor. But how could you go through all that training if you aren't going to use it? We were sitting on the bench looking out at the Hudson River. We were both wearing t-shirts in late April. All that education, all that money, that was the point, I said. You didn't want to go to medical school, fine. You got there in your own way. But you're a doctor now. You have to at least give it a try. I shook my head. There was a tugboat not too far from us, pushing an enormous barge, and I took the moment to revel in the physics. I am not going to be a doctor. You haven't even done it yet. You can't quit something you haven't started. I was still watching the river. That's what residency is. You are practicing medicine. Then what are you going to do with your life? Everything in me wanted to turn the question back on her, but I didn't. Real estate and development. I own 3 buildings. You're a doctor and you're going to sell real estate? There was no place for Celeste to cast her vote in the matter of my future. It's a little bit more than that. I could hear the peaceful condescension in my voice. She refused to grasp the simplest part of what I was saying. It's such a waste, she said, her eyes bright with anger. I don't know how you can live with it, really. You took someone's spot in the program. Do you ever think about that? Someone who wanted to be a doctor? Trust me, whoever that person was, he didn't want to be a doctor either. I did that guy a favor. The problem wasn't mine after all, it was hers. Celeste had her heart set on marrying a doctor. Maeve and I had been playing tennis over at the high school when she broke up the game after a single crack of lightning. I had an aluminum racket, and she said she wasn't about to watch me get electrocuted during a serve. And so we got in the car and drove to the Dutch house, just to check on things before dark. The summer was essentially over, and soon it would be time for me to go back to my second year at Choate. We were both miserable about it, each in our own way. I remember the very first time I saw this house, Maeve said, straight out of nowhere. The felted sky hung over us, waiting to split apart. You do not, you were just a baby then. She cracked down the window of the Volkswagen. I was almost 6. You remember things from when you were 6. I'll tell you what, You would have remembered coming here. And she was right, of course. I had remembered my life very clearly, ever since Fluffy cracked me open with a spoon. So what happened? Dad borrowed some guy's car, and he drove us up from Philadelphia. It must have been a Saturday, either that or he'd have taken off from work. Maeve stopped and looked through the linden trees, trying to put herself back there. In the summer, you really couldn't see anything. The leaves were so thick. Coming up the driveway, the house was shocking. That's the only word for it. I mean, it's second nature to you. You were born here. You probably grew up thinking everybody lived in a house like this. I shook my head. I thought everyone who went to Choate lived in a house like this. And Maeve laughed. Even though she'd forced me into boarding school, she was happy whenever I maligned it. Dad had already bought the place, and Mommy didn't know a goddamn thing about it. What? I'm serious. He bought it to her as a surprise for her. Where did he get the money? Even when I was in high school, that was my first question. Maeve shook her head. All I know is that we were living on the base, and he said we were going to go for a ride in his friend's car. Pack a lunch, everybody in. I mean, that was pretty crazy all by itself. It's not like we'd ever borrowed someone's car before. The family was the three of them. I was nowhere in the picture. Maeve had one tan arm stretched along the top of the seat behind my head. She'd gotten me a job at Otterson's for the summer, counting out plastic bags of corn and taping them into boxes. On the weekends, we played tennis at the high school. We kept our rackets and a can of tennis balls in the car, and sometimes she'd show up at lunch to whisk me off for a game. Right in the middle of the workday, and no one said a word to us about it, like she owned the place. Dad was practically gleeful on the drive. He kept pulling over to the side of the road to show me the cows, show me the sheep. I asked him where they slept at night, and he said there were barns, great big barns, just on the other side of that hill, and that every cow had her own room. Mommy just looked at him, and they broke up laughing. The whole thing was very jolly. I thought of the countless miles my father and I had locked in together over the years. He was not a man to pull the car over and look at a cow. Hard to picture. Like I said, it was a long time ago. Okay, so then you got here. She nodded, digging through her purse. Dad pulled all the way up to the front, and the three of us got out of the car and stood there gaping. Mommy asked him if it was a museum. He shook his head, and then she asked him if it was a library, and I said, "It's a house." Did it look the same? Pretty much. The yard was in rough shape. I remember the grass was really high, and Dad asked Mommy what she thought about the house, and Mommy said, "It's something all right." And then he looked right at her with this huge smile, and he said, "It's your house. I bought it for you." Seriously? The air inside the car was heavy and hot. Even with the windows down, our legs stuck to the seats. Not one clue. What was that supposed to be, romantic? I was a teenage boy, and the idea of buying your wife a mansion as a surprise had all the bells and whistles of love as I imagined it. But I also knew my sister, and I know she wasn't telling me a love story. So? Maeve lit a cigarette with a match. The lighter in the Volkswagen never worked. She didn't get it, though, really. How could she? The war had just ended. We were living at the naval base in some tiny little cracker box that had 2 rooms. He might as well have taken her to the Taj Mahal and said, "Okay, now we live here, just the 3 of us." Somebody could look you straight in the face and tell you that, and you aren't going to understand them. Did you go inside? Sure, we went inside. He had the keys in his pocket. He owned it. He took her hand and we went up the front stairs. When you think about it, this is really the entrance to the house. She held out her open palm to the landscape, the street, the trees, the driveway. That's what keeps people out. But then you get up to the house and the front is glass, so right away the whole thing is laid out for you. Not only have we never seen a house like this, we've never seen the kinds of things that belong in a house like this. Poor Mommy. Maeve shook her head at the thought. She was terrified, like he was going to shove her into a room full of tigers. She kept saying, "Cyril, this is someone's house. We can't go in there." This was how it had gone for the Conroys. One generation got shoved in the door, and the next generation got shoved out. What about you? She thought about it. I was a kid, so I was interested. I was upset for Mommy because she was so clearly petrified, but I also understood that this was our house, and we were going to live here. 5-year-olds have no comprehension of real estate. It's all about fairy tales, and in the fairy tale, you get the castle. I felt bad for Dad, if you want to know the truth. Nothing he was trying to do was going right. I might even have felt worse for him than I did for her. She filled her lungs with soft gray smoke and then sent it out on the soft gray sky. There's a staggering admission for you. Remember how hot the front hall would get in the afternoon, even when it wasn't hot outside? Sure, it was like that. We started to walk around, not very far at first, because Mommy didn't want to get too far from the door. I remember the ship in the grandfather's clock was just sitting in the waves because no one had wound it. I remember the marble floor and the chandelier. Dad was trying to be our tour guide. Look at this mirror. Look at the staircase. Like maybe she couldn't see the staircase. He'd bought the most beautiful house in Pennsylvania, and his wife was looking at him like he'd shot her. Well, we wound up going through every single room. Can you imagine? Mommy kept saying, "Who are these people? Why did they leave everything?" We went down the back hall with all those porcelain little birds sitting on their own little shelves. Oh my God, I loved those birds so much. I wanted to stick one in my pocket. Dad said the house had been built by the Van Hobeeks in the early 1920s, and all of them were dead. Then we went into the drawing room, and there they were, the giant Van Hobeeks, staring at us like we were thieves. All of them are dead, I said on my father's behalf, and I bought the house from the bank, and we get to keep all their stuff. Was everything still there? Were the clothes hanging in the closets? I didn't even know my mother, but I was feeling sick for her, and I thought about it that way. It took a while for Dad to get up the stairs. We went through all the bedrooms. Everything was there. Their beds and their pillows and the towels in their bathrooms. I remember there was a silver hairbrush on the dresser in the master bedroom that had hair in it. When we got to my room, Dad said, "Maeve, I thought you might like it here." What kind of a kid wouldn't like that room? Do you remember the night we showed it to Norma and Bright? I do, as a matter of fact. Well, I'll tell you, that was exactly what I felt like. I went straight to the window seat, and Dad pulled the drapes shut. Shangri-La I lost my mind, and then Mommy lost her mind because she was still thinking that this whole thing was going to be resolved and that I was going to be crushed to not have my own princess suite. She said, "Maeve, get out of there. That does not belong to you." But it did. I knew it did. You knew it at the time? I'd never be in a position of getting my head around what I'd been given. I only understood what I'd lost. She gave me a tired smile and ran her hand once over the back of my head. My hair was short, shaved at the neck. That's the way things were at Choate, even in the mid-60s. I understood parts of it, but no, to tell you the truth, I didn't really understand the whole thing until Norma and Bright did their own reenactment of my childhood. I think that's why I felt sorry for them, because in some way I was just feeling sorry for myself. That was the night for it. I was certainly feeling sorry for myself. Maeve let that go. For once it was her story and not mine. After the bedroom fiasco, we went up to the 3rd floor, and Dad wanted to show us everything. He knew the tour was getting worse, but he couldn't stop himself. The 3rd floor just about did him in. He wore a brace on his knee back then that didn't fit right, and he had to go straight leg in it up the stairs. The stairs were hell for him. He was okay to do 1 set, but not 2. He hadn't gone to the 3rd floor when he bought the place, and when we finally got up there, it turned out part of the ceiling in the ballroom had fallen in. It looked like a bomb had gone off, big chunks of plaster smashed all over the floor. Raccoons had eaten their way into the house, the ones with the fleas. They had ripped apart the mattress from the little bedroom to make their nest, and ripped apart the pillows and the spread, and there was fluff and feathers everywhere. There was this horrible feral smell, like a wild animal and the shit of that animal, and the dead cousin of that animal, all at the same time. She made a face at the memory. If he was looking to make a good first impression, he would not have taken us to the 3rd floor. I was still at a point in my life when the house was the hero and every story our lost and beloved country. There was a neat little boxwood hedge that had been trained to grow up and over the mailbox, and I wanted to get out of the car and go across the street and run my hand over it like I used to do whenever Sandy sent me out to get the mail, like it was my house even then. Please tell me you left after that. Oh, darling, no, we were just getting started. She turned her back on the house, and so that she was facing me. She was wearing the t-shirt I'd brought her home from Choate, and an old pair of shorts, and she pulled her long tan legs into the seat. Dad's leg was killing him, but he went out to the car and got the sack lunch, and then he got plates from the kitchen and filled the glasses with water from the tap and set us up in the dining room while Mommy sat on one of those awful French chairs in the foyer, shaking. He put the sandwiches on the plates and called us in to the dining room. I mean, if he'd even ever looked at her to see what was going on, he would have let us eat in the kitchen or in the car or someplace that didn't have a blue and gold ceiling. The dining room was intolerable in the very best of times, but he led her to the table like she was blind. She kept picking up her sandwich and putting it down, while Dad went on chirping about acreage and when the place was built, and how the Van Hobeeks had made their money in cigarettes during the last war. She took a final drag off her cigarette and stepped it into the ashtray of the car. Thank you, Van Hobeeks. There was a clap of thunder, and all at once the rain came. An enormous explosion, enormous drops that swept the windshield clean. Neither of us moved to roll up our window. But you didn't sleep there. I said it as if I knew, because I not bear to hear otherwise. She shook her head. The rain made such a pounding on the roof that she had to raise her voice a little. Our backs were getting soaked. No, he took us around outside for a minute, but the grounds were a mess. The pool was full of leaves. I wanted to take my shoes and socks off and put my feet in the water, but Mommy said no. I thought she was holding my hand because she was afraid I was going to run away, but she was holding on to me because, you know, she needed to hold on. Then Dad clapped his hands together and said we should probably be heading home. He had borrowed the car from the banker for the day, and he had to give it back. Can you imagine? He buys this house, but he doesn't own a car. We went back inside, and he picks up all the sandwiches and wraps them and puts them back in the bag. None of us had really eaten anything, so of course we were going to take the sandwiches home and have them for dinner. He wasn't going to waste the sandwiches. Mother started to pick up the plates, and Dad, I remember this most of all, he touched her wrist and he said, "Leave those. The girl will get them." No. And Mommy said, "What girl?" Like on top of everything else, she now has a slave? Fluffy. God's truth, Maeve said. Our father was a man who had never met his own wife.
Maybe tell everyone that tomorrow we'll be taking the day off, and we'll do 2 chapters on Monday.
Oh. Say it again. Well, tomorrow we'll be off, but there will be 2 chapters on Monday. So that's it for today.